St. John paled and hastened to say, "I was in fault, I do confess it. Betray me not. Grant me this grace out of thy courtesy, and I will neither think nor speak of this thing more. Deal not hardly with me, sir, else am I ruined." "I am content, my lord, so thou offend not again, here or in the ears of others. It shall be as though thou hadst not spoken. But thou needst not have misgivings. He is my sister's son. Are not his voice, his face, his form familiar to me from his cradle? Madness can do all the odd, conflicting things thou seest in him, and more. Dost not recall how that the old Baron Marley, being mad, forgot the favor of his own countenance that he had known for 60 years, and held it was another's? Nay, even claimed he was the son of Mary Magdalene, and that his head was made of Spanish glass, and, sooth to say, he suffered none to touch it, lest by mischance some heedless hand might shiver it. Give thy misgivings easement, good my lord. This is the very prince, I know him well, and soon will be thy king. It may advantage thee to bear this in mind, and more dwell upon it than the other." After some further talk, in which the Lord St. John covered up his mistake as well as he could by repeated protests that his faith was thoroughly grounded now, and could not be assailed by doubts again, the Lord Harford relieved his fellow-keeper and sat down to keep watch and ward alone. He was soon deep in meditation, and evidently the longer he thought, the more he was bothered. By and by he began to pace the floor and mutter, "Tush, he must be the prince. Will any he in all the land maintain there can be two, not of one blood and birth, so marvelously twinned? And even were it so, 'twere yet a stranger miracle that chance should cast the one into the other's place. Nay, 'tis folly, folly, folly." Presently he said, "Now, were he impostor, and called himself prince, look you, that would be natural, that would be reasonable. But lived ever an impostor yet, who, being called prince by the king, prince by the court, prince by all, denied his dignity, and pleaded against his exaltation? No, by the soul of St. Swithin, no. This is the true prince, gone mad." Chapter 7. Tom's First Royal Dinner. Somewhat after 1 in the afternoon, Tom resignedly underwent the ordeal of being dressed for dinner. He found himself as finely clothed as before, but everything different, everything changed, from his ruff to his stockings. He was presently conducted with much state to a spacious and ornate apartment, where a table was already set for one. Its furniture was all of massy gold, and beautified with designs which well-nigh made it priceless, since they were the work of Benvenuto. The room was half filled with noble servitors. A chaplain said grace, and Tom was about to fall to, for hunger had long been constitutional with him, but was interrupted by my lord the Earl of Berkeley, who fastened a napkin about his neck, for the great post of diaperers to the princes of Wales was hereditary in this nobleman's family. Tom's cupbearer was present, and forestalled all his attempts to help himself to wine. The taster to His Highness the Prince of Wales was there also, prepared to taste any suspicious dish upon requirement, and run the risk of being poisoned. He was only an ornamental appendage at this time, and was seldom called upon to exercise his function, but there had been times, not many generations past, when the office of taster had its perils, and was not a grandeur to be desired. Why they did not use a dog or a plumber seems strange. But all the ways of royalty are strange. My Lord Darcy, first groom of the chamber, was there to do goodness knows what, but there he was, let that suffice. The Lord Chief Butler was there, and stood behind Tom's chair, overseeing the solemnities under command of the Lord Great Steward and the Lord Head Cook, who stood near. Tom had 384 servants besides these, but they were not all in that room, of course, nor the quarter of them. Neither was Tom aware yet that they existed. All those that were present had been well drilled within the hour to remember that the prince was temporarily out of his head, and to be careful to show no surprise at his vagaries. These vagaries were soon on exhibition before them, but they only moved their compassion and their sorrow, not their mirth. It was a heavy affliction to them to see the beloved prince so stricken. Poor Tom ate with his fingers mainly, but no one smiled at it or even seemed to observe it. He inspected his napkin curiously and with deep interest, for it was of a very dainty and beautiful fabric, then said with simplicity, "Prithee, take it away, lest in mine unheedfulness it be soiled." The hereditary diaperer took it away with reverent manner, and without word or protest of any sort. Tom examined the turnips and the lettuce with interest, and asked what they were, and if they were to be eaten, for it was only recently that men had begun to raise these things in England, in place of importing them as luxuries from Holland. Note 4. It was not till the end of this reign, Henry VIII, that any salads, carrots, turnips, or other edible roots were produced in England. The little of these vegetables that was used was formerly imported from Holland and Flanders. Queen Catherine, when she wanted a salad, was obliged to dispatch a messenger thither on purpose. Hume's History of England, Volume 3, page 314. His question was answered with grave respect, and no surprise manifested. When he had finished his dessert, he filled his pockets with nuts, but nobody appeared to be aware of it or disturbed by it. But the next moment he was himself disturbed by it and showed discomposure, for this was the only service he had been permitted to do with his own hands during the meal, and he did not doubt that he had done a most improper and unprincely thing. At that moment the muscles of his nose began to twitch, and the end of that organ to lift and wrinkle. This continued, and Tom began to evince a growing distress. He looked appealingly first at one and then another of the lords about him, and tears came into his eyes. They sprang forward with dismay in their faces and begged to know his trouble. Tom said with genuine anguish, "I crave your indulgence. My nose itcheth cruelly. What is the custom and usage in this emergency? Prithee speed, for 'tis but a little time that I can bear it." None smiled, but all were sore perplexed, and looked one to the other in deep tribulation for counsel. But behold, here was a dead wall, and nothing in English history to tell how to get over it. The master of ceremonies was not present. There was no one who felt safe to venture upon this uncharted sea, or risk the attempt to solve this solemn problem. Alas, there was no hereditary scratcher. Meantime, the tears had overflowed their banks and begun to trickle down Tom's cheeks. His twitching nose was pleading more urgently than ever for relief. At last, nature broke down the barriers of etiquette. Tom lifted up an inward prayer for pardon if he was doing wrong, and brought relief to the burdened hearts of his court by scratching his nose himself. His meal being ended, a lord came and held before him a broad, shallow golden dish with fragrant rose water in it to cleanse his mouth and fingers with. And my lord the hereditary diaperer stood by with a napkin for his use. Tom gazed at the dish a puzzled moment or two, then raised it to his lips and gravely took a draught. Then he returned it to the waiting lord, and said, "Nay, it likes me not, my lord. It hath a pretty flavour, but it wanteth strength." This new eccentricity of the prince's ruined mind made all the hearts about him ache, but the sad sight moved none to merriment. Tom's next unconscious blunder was to get up and leave the table just when the chaplain had taken his stand behind his chair, and with uplifted hands and closed, uplifted eyes, was in the act of beginning the blessing. Still, nobody seemed to perceive that the prince had done a thing unusual. By his own request, our small friend was now conducted to his private cabinet, and left there alone to his own devices. Hanging upon hooks in the oaken wainscoting were the several pieces of a suit of shining steel armor, covered all over with beautiful designs, exquisitely inlaid in gold. This martial panoply belonged to the true prince, a recent present from Madame Parr, the queen. Tom put on the greaves, the gauntlets, the plumed helmet, and such other pieces as he could don without assistance, and for a while was minded to call for help and complete the matter, but bethought him of the nuts he had brought away from dinner, and the joy it would be to eat them with no crowd to eye him, and no grand hereditaries to pester him with undesired services. So he restored the pretty things to their several places, and soon was cracking nuts, and feeling almost naturally happy for the first time, since God for his sins had made him a prince. When the nuts were all gone, he stumbled upon some inviting books in a closet, among them one about the etiquette of the English court. This was a prize. He lay down upon a sumptuous divan, and proceeded to instruct himself with honest zeal. Let us leave him there for the present. Chapter 8. The Question of the Seal. About 5 o'clock, Henry VIII awoke out of an unrefreshing nap, and muttered to himself, troublous dreams, mine end is now at hand, so say these warnings, and my failing pulses do confirm it." Presently a wicked light flamed up in his eyes, and he muttered, "Yet will not I die, till he go before." His attendants, perceiving that he was awake, one of them asked his pleasure concerning the Lord Chancellor, who was waiting without. "Admit him! Admit him!" exclaimed the king eagerly. The Lord Chancellor entered and knelt by the king's couch, saying, "I have given order, and according to the king's command, the peers of the realm in their robes do now stand at the bar of the house, where, having confirmed the Duke of Norfolk's doom, they humbly wait his Majesty's further pleasure in the matter." The king's face lit up with a fierce joy. Said he, "Lift me up. In mine own person will I go before my Parliament, and with mine own hand will I seal the warrant that rids me of—" His voice failed. An ashen pallor swept the flush from his cheeks, and the attendants eased him back upon his pillows, and hurriedly assisted him with restoratives. Presently he said sorrowfully, "Alack, how have I longed for this sweet hour! And lo, too late it cometh, and I am robbed of this so coveted chance. But speed ye, speed ye. Let others do this happy office, if 'tis denied to me. I put my great seal in commission. Choose thou the lords that shall compose it, and get ye to your work. Speed ye, man, before the sun shall rise and set again, bring me his head, that I may see it." "According to the king's command, so shall it be. Will't please your majesty to order that the seal be now restored to me, so that I may forth upon the business?" "The seal? Who keepeth the seal but thou?" "Please your majesty, you did take it from me 2 days since, saying it should no more do its office till your own royal hand should use it upon the Duke of Norfolk's warrant." "Why, so in sooth I did, I do remember it. What did I with it? I am very feeble. So oft these days doth my memory play the traitor with me. 'Tis strange, strange." The king dropped into inarticulate mumblings, shaking his gray head weakly from time to time, and gropingly trying to recollect what he had done with the seal. At last my Lord Hertford ventured to kneel and offered information. "Sire, if that I may be so bold, here be several that do remember with me how you gave the great seal into the hands of his highness, the Prince of Wales, to keep against the day that—" "True, most true," interrupted the king. "Fetch it, go, time flieth." Lord Hertford flew to Tom, but returned to the king before very long, troubled and empty-handed. He delivered himself to this effect: "It grieveth me, my lord the king, to bear so heavy and unwelcome tidings, but it is the will of God that the prince's affliction abideth still, and he cannot recall to mind that he received the seal. So came I quickly to report, thinking it were waste of precious time, and little worth withal, that any should attempt to search the long array of chambers and saloons that belong unto his royal high—" A groan from the king interrupted my lord at this point. After a little while his majesty said with a deep sadness in his tone, "Trouble him no more, poor child. The hand of God lieth heavy upon him, and my heart goeth out in loving compassion for him, and sorrow that I may not bear his burden on mine own old trouble-weighted shoulders, and so bring him peace." He closed his eyes, fell to mumbling, and presently was silent. After a time he opened his eyes again and gazed vacantly around until his glance rested upon the kneeling Lord Chancellor. Instantly his face flushed with wrath. "What, thou here yet? By the glory of God, and thou gett'st not about that traitor's business, thy mitre shall have holiday the morrow for lack of a head to grace withal." The trembling chancellor answered, "Good your majesty, I cry you mercy, but I waited for the seal." "Man, hast lost thy wits? The small seal, which aforetime I was wont to take with me abroad, lieth in my treasury, and since the great seal hath flown away, shall not it suffice? Hast lost thy wits? Begone, and hark ye, come no more till thou do bring his head." The poor chancellor was not long in removing himself from this dangerous vicinity, nor did the commission waste time in giving the royal assent to the work of the slavish parliament, and appointing the morrow for the beheading of the premier peer of England, the luckless Duke of Norfolk. Note 5. Attainder of Norfolk. The House of Peers, without examining the prisoner, without trial or evidence, passed a bill of attainder against him, and sent it down to the Commons. The obsequious Commons obeyed the king's directions, and the king, having affixed the royal assent to the bill by commissioners, issued orders for the execution of Norfolk on the morning of the 29th of January, the next day. Hume's England, Volume 3, page 306. Chapter 9. The River Pageant. At 9 in the evening, the whole vast river front of the palace was blazing with light. The river itself, as far as the eye could reach citywards, was so thickly covered with watermen's boats and with pleasure barges, all fringed with colored lanterns and gently agitated by the waves, that it resembled a glowing and limitless garden of flowers stirred to soft motion by summer winds. The grand terrace of stone steps leading down to the water, spacious enough to mass the army of a German principality upon, was a picture to see, with its ranks of royal halberdiers in polished armor, and its troops of brilliant costumed servitors flitting up and down and to and fro in the hurry of preparation. Presently a command was given, and immediately all living creatures vanished from the steps. Now the air was heavy with the hush of suspense and expectancy. As far as one's vision could carry, he might see the myriads of people in the boats rise up and shade their eyes from the glare of lanterns and torches and gaze toward the palace. A file of 40 or 50 state barges drew up to the steps. They were richly gilt, and their lofty prows and sterns were elaborately carved. Some of them were decorated with banners and streamers, some with cloth of gold, and arras embroidered with coats of arms, and others with silken flags that had numberless little silver bells fastened to them, which shook out tiny showers of joyous music whenever the breezes fluttered them. Others, of yet higher pretensions, since they belonged to nobles in the prince's immediate service, had their sides picturesquely fenced with shields, gorgeously emblazoned with armorial bearings. Each state barge was towed by a tender. Besides the rowers, these tenders carried each a number of men-at-arms in glossy helmet and breastplate, and a company of musicians. The advance guard of the expected procession now appeared in the great gateway, a troop of halberdiers. They were dressed in striped hose of black and tawny, velvet caps graced at the sides with silver roses, and doublets of murrey and blue cloth, embroidered on the front and back with the 3 feathers, the prince's blazon, woven in gold. Their halberd staves were covered with crimson velvet, fastened with gilt nails, and ornamented with gold tassels. Filing off on the right and left, they formed 2 long lines extending from the gateway of the palace to the water's edge. A thick rayed cloth or carpet was then unfolded and laid down between them by attendants in the gold and crimson liveries of the prince. This done, a flourish of trumpets resounded from within. A lively prelude arose from the musicians on the water, and 2 ushers with white wands marched with a slow and stately pace from the portal. They were followed by an officer bearing the civic mace, after whom came another carrying the city's sword. Then several sergeants of the city guard in their full accoutrements and with badges on their sleeves, then the Garter King-at-Arms in his tabard, then several knights of the Bath, each with a white lance on his sleeve, then their esquires, then the judges in their robes of scarlet and coifs, then the Lord High Chancellor of England in a robe of scarlet, open before and purfled with miniver, then a deputation of aldermen in their scarlet cloaks, and then the heads of the different civic companies in their robes of state. Now came 12 French gentlemen in splendid habiliments, consisting of pourpoints of white damask barred with gold, short mantles of crimson velvet lined with violet taffeta, and carnation-colored eau de chose, and took their way down the steps. They were of the suite of the French ambassador, and were followed by 12 cavaliers of the suite of the Spanish ambassador, clothed in black velvet, unrelieved by any ornament. Following these came several great English nobles with their attendants. There was a flourish of trumpets within, and the prince's uncle, the future great Duke of Somerset, emerged from the gateway, arrayed in a doublet of black cloth of gold, and a cloak of crimson satin, flowered with gold, and ribanded with nets of silver. He turned, doffed his plumed cap, bent his body in a low reverence, and began to step backward, bowing at each step. A prolonged trumpet blast followed, and a proclamation, "Way for the high and mighty, the Lord Edward, Prince of Wales!" High aloft on the palace walls, a long line of red tongues of flame leaped forth with a thunder crash. The massed world on the river burst into a mighty roar of welcome, and Tom Canty, the cause and hero of it all, stepped into view and slightly bowed his princely head. He was magnificently habited in a doublet of white satin, with a front piece of purple cloth of tissue, powdered with diamonds, and edged with ermine. Over this he wore a mantle of white cloth of gold, pounced with the triple feather crest, lined with blue satin, set with pearls and precious stones, and fastened with a clasp of brilliants. About his neck hung the Order of the Garter, and several princely foreign orders, and wherever light fell upon him, jewels responded with a blinding flash. Oh, Tom Canty, born in a hovel, bred in the gutters of London, familiar with rags and dirt and misery, what a spectacle is this! Chapter 10. The Prince in the Toils. We left John Canty dragging the rightful prince into awful court, with a noisy and delighted mob at his heels. There was but one person in it who offered a pleading word for the captive, and he was not heeded. He was hardly even heard, so great was the turmoil. The prince continued to struggle for freedom and to rage against the treatment he was suffering, until John Canty lost what little patience was left in him, and raised his oaken cudgel in a sudden fury over the prince's head. The single pleader for the lad sprang to stop the man's arm, and the blow descended upon his own wrist. Canty roared out, "Thou'lt meddle, wilt thou? Then have thy reward." His cudgel crashed down upon the meddler's head. There was a groan, a dim form sank to the ground among the feet of the crowd, and the next moment it lay there in the dark, alone. The mob pressed on, their enjoyment nothing disturbed by this episode. Presently the prince found himself in John Canty's abode, with the door closed against the outsiders. By the vague light of a tallow candle, which was thrust into a bottle, he made out the main features of the loathsome den, and also the occupants of it. 2 frowsy girls and a middle-aged woman cowered against the wall in one corner, with the aspect of animals habituated to harsh usage, and expecting and dreading it now. From another corner stole a withered hag with streaming gray hair and malignant eyes. John Canty said to this one, "Tarry, there's fine mummeries here. Mar them not till thou'st enjoyed them. Then let thy hand be heavy as thou wilt. Stand forth, lad. Now, say thy foolery again, and thou'st not forgot it. Name thy name. Who art thou?" The insulted blood mounted to the little prince's cheek once more, and he lifted a steady and indignant gaze to the man's face, and said, "'Tis but ill-breeding in such as thou to command me to speak. I tell thee now, as I told thee before, I am Edward, Prince of Wales, and none other." The stunning surprise of this reply nailed the hag's feet to the floor where she stood, and almost took her breath. She stared at the prince in stupid amazement, which so amused her ruffianly son that he burst into a roar of laughter. But the effect upon Tom Canty's mother and sisters was different. Their dread of bodily injury gave way at once to distress of a different sort. They ran forward with woe and dismay in their faces, exclaiming, "Oh, poor Tom, poor lad!" The mother fell on her knees before the prince, put her hands upon his shoulders, and gazed yearningly into his face through her rising tears. Then she said, "Oh, my poor boy, thy foolish reading hath wrought its woeful work at last, and ta'en thy wit away. Ah, why didst thou cleave to it when I so warned thee gainst it? Thou'st broke thy mother's heart." The prince looked into her face and said gently, "Thy son is well, and hath not lost his wits, good dame. Comfort thee. Let me to the palace where he is, and straightway will the king my father restore him to thee." "The king thy father? Oh, my child, unsay these words, that be freighted with death for thee, and ruin for all that be near to thee. Shake off this gruesome dream. Call back thy poor wandering memory. Look upon me. Am I not thy mother that bore thee and loveth thee?" The prince shook his head, and reluctantly said, "God knoweth I am loath to grieve thy heart, but truly have I never looked upon thy face before." The woman sank back to a sitting posture on the floor, and covering her eyes with her hands, gave way to heartbroken sobs and wailings. "Let the show go on," shouted Canty. "What, Nan? What bet? Mannerless wenches, will ye stand in the prince's presence? Upon your knees, ye pauper scum, and do him reverence." He followed this with another hoarse laugh. The girls began to plead timidly for their brother, and Nan said, "An thou wilt but let him to bed, father, rest and sleep will heal his madness, prithee do." "Do, father," said Bet. "He is more worn than is his wont. Tomorrow will he be himself again, and will beg with diligence, and come not empty home again." This remark sobered the father's joviality and brought his mind to business. He turned angrily upon the prince and said, "The morrow must we pay 2 pennies to him that owns this hole. 2 pennies, mark ye, all this money for a half-year's rent, else out of this we go. Show what thou'st gathered with thy lazy begging." The prince said, "Offend me not with thy sordid matters. I tell thee again, I am the king's son." A sounding blow upon the prince's shoulder from Canty's broad palm sent him staggering into Goodwife Canty's arms, who clasped him to her breast and sheltered him from a pelting rain of cuffs and slaps by interposing her own person. The frightened girls retreated to their corner, but the grandmother stepped eagerly forward to assist her son. The prince sprang away from Mrs. Canty, exclaiming, "Thou shalt not suffer for me, madam. Let these swine do their will upon me alone." This speech infuriated the swine to such a degree that they set about their work without waste of time. Between them they belabored the boy right soundly, and then gave the girls and their mother a beating for showing sympathy for the victim. "Now," said Canty, "to bed, all of ye. The entertainment has tired me." The light was put out, and the family retired. As soon as the snorings of the head of the house and his mother showed that they were asleep, the young girls crept to where the prince lay and covered him tenderly from the cold with straw and rags. And their mother crept to him also and stroked his hair, and cried over him, whispering broken words of comfort and compassion in his ear the while. She had saved a morsel for him to eat also, But the boy's pains had swept away all appetite, at least for black and tasteless crusts. He was touched by her brave and costly defense of him, and by her commiseration, and he thanked her in very noble and princely words, and begged her to go to her sleep and try to forget her sorrows. And he added that the king his father would not let her loyal kindness and devotion go unrewarded. This return to his madness broke her heart anew, and she strained him to her breast again and again, and then went back, drowned in tears, to her bed. As she lay thinking and mourning, the suggestion began to creep into her mind that there was an undefinable something about this boy that was lacking in Tom Canty, mad or sane. She could not describe it. She could not tell just what it was, and yet her sharp mother instinct seemed to detect it and perceive it. What if the boy were really not her son, after all? Oh, absurd! She almost smiled at the idea, spite of her griefs and troubles. No matter. She found that it was an idea that would not down, but persisted in haunting her. It pursued her, it harassed her, it clung to her and refused to be put away or ignored. At last she perceived that there was not going to be any peace for her until she should devise a test that should prove, clearly and without question, whether this lad was her son or not, and so banish these wearing and worrying doubts. Ah, yes, this was plainly the right way out of the difficulty. Therefore she set her wits to work at once to contrive that test. But it was an easier thing to propose than to accomplish. She turned over in her mind one promising test after another, but was obliged to relinquish them all. None of them were absolutely sure, absolutely perfect, and an imperfect one could not satisfy her. Evidently she was racking her head in vain. It seemed manifest that she must give the matter up. While this depressing thought was passing through her mind, her ear caught the regular breathing of the boy, and she knew he had fallen asleep. And while she listened, the measured breathing was broken by a soft, startled cry, such as one utters in a troubled dream. This chance occurrence furnished her instantly with a plan worth all her labored tests combined. She at once set herself feverishly but noiselessly to work to relight her candle, muttering to herself, "Had I but seen him then, I should have known. Since that day when he was little, that the powder burst in his face, he hath never been startled of a sudden out of his dreams or out of his thinkings, but he hath cast his hand before his eyes, even as he did that day, and not as others would do it with the palm inward, but always with the palm turned outward. I have seen it 100 times, and it hath never varied nor ever failed. Yes, I shall soon know now." By this time she had crept to the slumbering boy's side with the candle shaded in her hand. She bent heedfully and warily over him, scarcely breathing in her suppressed excitement, and suddenly flashed the light in his face and struck the floor by his ear with her knuckles. The sleeper's eyes sprung wide open, and he cast a startled stare about him, but he made no special movement with his hands. The poor woman was smitten almost helpless with surprise and grief, but she contrived to hide her emotions and to soothe the boy to sleep again. Then she crept apart and communed miserably with herself upon the disastrous result of her experiment. She tried to believe that her Tom's madness had banished this habitual gesture of his, but she could not do it. "No," she said, "his hands are not mad. They could not unlearn so old a habit in so brief a time. Oh, this is a heavy day for me." Still, hope was as stubborn now as doubt had been before. She could not bring herself to accept the verdict of the test. She must try the thing again. The failure must have been only an accident. So she startled the boy out of his sleep a second and a third time at intervals with the same result, which had marked the first test. Then she dragged herself to bed and fell sorrowfully asleep, saying, "But I cannot give him up. Oh, no, I cannot. He must be my boy." The poor mother's interruptions having ceased, and the prince's pains having gradually lost their power to disturb him, utter weariness at last sealed his eyes in a profound and restful sleep. Hour after hour slipped away, and still he slept like the dead. Thus 4 or 5 hours passed. Then his stupor began to lighten. Presently, while half asleep and half awake, he murmured, "Sir William." After a moment, "Ho, Sir William Herbert, hie thee hither, and list to the strangest dream that ever. Sir William, dost hear? Man, I did think me changed to a pauper, and, ho there, guards! Sir William, what? Is there no groom of the chamber in waiting? Alack, it shall go hard with—" "What aileth thee?" asked a whisper near him. "Who art thou calling? Sir William Herbert, who art thou?" "I? Who should I be but thy sister Nan? Oh, Tom, I had forgot. Thou art mad yet. Poor lad, thou art mad yet. Would I had never woke to know it again. But prithee master thy tongue, lest we be all beaten till we die." The startled prince sprang partly up, but a sharp reminder from his stiffened bruises brought him to himself, and he sunk back among his foul straw with a moan and the ejaculation, "Alas, it was no dream, then." In a moment all the heavy sorrow and misery which sleep had banished were upon him again, and he realized that he was no longer a petted prince in a palace, with the adoring eyes of a nation upon him, but a pauper, an outcast, clothed in rags, prisoner in a den fit only for beasts, and consorting with beggars and thieves. In the midst of his grief he began to be conscious of hilarious noises and shoutings, apparently but a block or two away. The next moment there were several sharp raps at the door. John Canty ceased from snoring and said, "Who knocketh? What wilt thou?" A voice answered, "Knowest thou who it was thou laid thy cudgel on?" "No, neither know I nor care." "Belike thou'lt change thy note eftsoons, and thou would save thy neck, nothing but flight may stead thee. The man is this moment delivering up the ghost. 'Tis the priest, Father Andrew." "God a mercy!" exclaimed Canty. He roused his family and hoarsely commanded, "Up with ye all and fly, or bide where ye are and perish." Scarcely 5 minutes later the Canty household were in the street, and flying for their lives. John Canty held the prince by the wrist and hurried him along the dark way, giving him this caution in a low voice, "Mind thy tongue, thou mad fool, and speak not our name. I will choose me a new name speedily to throw the law's dogs off the scents. Mind thy tongue, I tell thee." He growled these words to the rest of the family, "If it so chance that we be separated, let each make for London Bridge. Whoso findeth himself as far as the last linen-draper's shop on the bridge, let him tarry there till the others be come. Then will we flee into Southwark together." At this moment the party burst suddenly out of the darkness into light, and not only into light, but into the midst of a multitude of singing, dancing, and shouting people massed together on the river frontage. There was a line of bonfires stretching as far as one could see up and down the Thames. London Bridge was illuminated, Southwark Bridge likewise. The entire river was aglow with the flash and sheen of colored lights, and constant explosions of fireworks filled the skies with an intricate commingling of shooting splendors and a thick rain of dazzling sparks that almost turned night into day. Everywhere were crowds of revelers. All London seemed to be at large. John Canty delivered himself of a furious curse and commanded a retreat, but it was too late. He and his tribe were swallowed up in that swarming hive of humanity and hopelessly separated from each other in an instant. We are not considering that the prince was one of his tribe. Canty still held his grip upon him. The prince's heart was beating high with hopes of escape now. A burly waterman, considerably exalted with liquor, found himself rudely shoved by Canty in his efforts to plow through the crowd. He laid his great hand on Canty's shoulder and said, "Nay, whither so fast, friend? Dost canker thy soul with sordid business, when all that be leal men and true make holiday?" "Mine affairs are mine own, they concern thee not," answered Canty roughly. "Take away thy hand, and let me pass." "Sith that in thy honour thou'lt not pass till thou'st drunk to the Prince of Wales, I tell thee that," said the waterman, barring the way resolutely. "Give me the cup, then, and make speed, make speed." Other revellers were interested by this time. They cried out, "The loving cup, the loving cup! Make the sour knave drink the loving cup, else will we feed him to the fishes." So a huge loving cup was brought, the waterman grasping it by one of its handles, and with his other hand bearing up the end of an imaginary napkin, presented it in due and ancient form to Canty, who had to grasp the opposite handle with one of his hands, and take off the lid with the other according to ancient custom. Note 6. The loving cup and the peculiar ceremonies observed in drinking from it are older than English history. It is thought that both are Danish importations. As far back as knowledge goes, the loving cup has always been drunk at English banquets. Tradition explains the ceremonies in this way. In the rude ancient times, it was deemed a wise precaution to have both hands of both drinkers employed, lest while the pledger pledged his love and fidelity to the pledgee take that opportunity to slip a dirk into him. This left the prince hand-free for a second, of course. He wasted no time, but dived among the forest of legs about him and disappeared. In another moment he could not have been harder to find under that tossing sea of life, if its billows had been the Atlantic's, and he a lost sixpence. He very soon realized this fact, and straightway busied himself about his own affairs, without further thought of John Canty. He quickly realized another thing, too, to wit that a spurious Prince of Wales was being feasted by the city in his stead. He easily concluded that the pauper lad, Tom Canty, had deliberately taken advantage of his stupendous opportunity and become a usurper. Therefore, there was but one course to pursue: find his way to the Guildhall, make himself known, and denounce the impostor. He also made up his mind that Tom should be allowed a reasonable time for spiritual preparation, and then be hanged, drawn, and quartered according to the law and usage of the day in cases of high treason. Chapter 11. At Guildhall. The royal barge, attended by its gorgeous fleet, took its stately way down the Thames through the wilderness of illuminated boats. The air was laden with music. The river banks were beruffled with joy flames. The distant city lay in a soft, luminous glow from its countless invisible bonfires. Above it rose many a slender spire into the sky, encrusted with sparkling lights, wherefore in their remoteness they seemed like jeweled lances thrust aloft. As the fleet swept along, it was greeted from the banks with a continuous hoarse roar of cheers, and the ceaseless flash and boom of artillery. To Tom Canty, half buried in his silken cushions, these sounds and this spectacle were a wonder unspeakably sublime and astonishing. To his little friends at his side, the Princess Elizabeth and the Lady Jane Grey, they were nothing. Arrived at the Dowgate, the fleet was towed up the limpid Walbrook, whose channel has now been for 2 centuries buried out of sight under acres of buildings, to Bucklersbury, past houses and under bridges populous with merrymakers and brilliantly lighted, and at last came to a halt in a basin where now is Barge Yard, in the center of the ancient city of London. Tom disembarked, and he and his gallant procession crossed Cheapside, and made a short march through the Old Jewry and Basinghall Street to the Guildhall. Tom and his little ladies were received with due ceremony by the Lord Mayor and the fathers of the city, in their gold chains and scarlet robes of state, and conducted to a rich canopy of estate at the head of the great hall, preceded by heralds making proclamation, and by the mace and the city sword. The lords and ladies who were to attend upon Tom and his 2 small friends took their places behind their chairs. At a lower table, the court grandees and other guests of noble degree were seated with the magnates of the city. The commoners took places at a multitude of tables on the main floor of the hall. From their lofty vantage ground, the giants Gog and Magog, the ancient guardians of the city, contemplated the spectacle below them with eyes grown familiar to it in forgotten generations. There was a bugle blast and a proclamation, and a fat butler appeared in a high perch in the leftward wall, followed by his servitors bearing with impressive solemnity a royal baron of beef, smoking hot and ready for the knife. After grace, Tom, being instructed, rose, and the whole house with him, and drank from a portly golden loving-cup with the Princess Elizabeth. From her it passed to the Lady Jane, and then traversed the general assemblage. So the banquet began. By midnight the revelry was at its height. Now came one of those picturesque spectacles so admired in that old day. A description of it is still extant in the quaint wording of a chronicler who witnessed it. Space being made, presently entered a baron and an earl, apparelled after the Turkish fashion, in long robes of bodkin powdered with gold, hats on their heads of crimson velvet, with great rolls of gold, girded with 2 swords called scimitars, hanging by great baldricks of gold. Next came yet another baron and another earl, in 2 long gowns of yellow satin, traversed with white satin, and in every bend of white was a bend of crimson satin, after the fashion of Russia, with furred hats of gray on their heads, either of them having an hatchet in their hands, and boots with pikes, points a foot long, turned up. And after them came a knight, then the Lord High Admiral, and with him 5 nobles in doublets of crimson velvet, voided low on the back and before to the cannel bone, laced on the breasts with chains of silver, and over that short cloaks of crimson satin, and on their heads hats after the dancers' fashion, with pheasants' feathers in them. These were apparelled after the fashion of Prussia. The torch-bearers, which were about 100, were apparelled in crimson satin and green, like Moors, their faces black. Next came in a momery. Then the minstrels, which were disguised, danced, and the lords and ladies did wildly dance also, that it was a pleasure to behold. And while Tom, in his high seat, was gazing upon this wild dancing, lost in admiration of the dazzling commingling of kaleidoscopic colors which the whirling turmoil of gaudy figures below him presented, the ragged but real little Prince of Wales was proclaiming his rights and wrongs, denouncing the impostor, and clamoring for admission at the gates of Guildhall. The crowd enjoyed this episode prodigiously, and pressed forward and craned their necks to see the small rioter. Presently they began to taunt him and mock at him, purposely to goad him to a higher and still more entertaining fury. Tears of mortification sprung to his eyes, but he stood his ground and defied the mob right royally. Other taunts followed, added mockings stung him, and he exclaimed, "I tell ye again, you pack of unmannerly curs, I am the Prince of Wales, and all forlorn and friendless as I be, with none to give me word of grace or help me in my need, yet will not I be driven from my ground, but will maintain it. Though thou be prince or no prince, 'tis all one. Thou beest a gallant lad, and not friendless neither. Here stand I by thy side to prove it, and mind I tell thee thou mightst have a worser friend than Miles Hendon, and yet not tire thy legs with seeking. Rest thy small jaw, my child. I talk the language of these base kennel rats, like to a very native." The speaker was a sort of Don Cesar de Bazan in dress, aspect, and bearing. He was tall, trim-built, muscular. His doublet and trunks were of a rich material, but faded and threadbare, and their gold lace adornments were sadly tarnished. His ruff was rumpled and damaged. The plume in his slouched hat was broken, and had a bedraggled and disreputable look. At his side he wore a long rapier in a rusty iron sheath. His swaggering carriage marked him at once as a ruffler of the camp. The speech of this fantastic figure was received with an explosion of jeers and laughter. Some cried, "'Tis another prince in disguise. Wear thy tongue, friend, belike he is dangerous. Marry, he looketh it, mark his eye. Pluck the lad from him, to the horse-pond with the cub." Instantly a hand was laid upon the prince, under the impulse of this happy thought. As instantly the stranger's long sword was out, and the meddler went to the earth under a sounding thump with the flat of it. The next moment a score of voices shouted, "Kill the dog! Kill him! Kill him!" And the mob closed in on the warrior, who backed himself against a wall and began to lay about him with his long weapon like a madman. His victims sprawled this way and that, but the mob tide poured over their prostrate forms and dashed itself against the champion with undiminished fury. His moments seemed numbered, his destruction certain, when suddenly a trumpet blast sounded, a voice shouted, "Way for the king's messenger!" and a troop of horsemen came charging down upon the mob, who fled out of harm's reach as fast as their legs could carry them. The bold stranger caught up the prince in his arms, and was soon far away from danger and the multitude. Return we within the Guildhall. Suddenly, high above the jubilant roar and thunder of the revel, broke the clear peal of a bugle note. There was instant silence, a deep hush, then a single voice rose, that of the messenger from the palace, and began to pipe forth a proclamation, the whole multitude standing, listening. The closing words, solemnly pronounced, were, "The king is dead." The great assemblage bent their heads upon their breasts with one accord, remained so in profound silence a few moments, then all sunk upon their knees in a body, stretched out their hands toward Tom, and a mighty shout burst forth that seemed to shake the building, "Long live the king!" Poor Tom's dazed eyes wandered abroad over this stupefying spectacle, and finally rested dreamily upon the kneeling princesses beside him a moment, then upon the Earl of Hertford. A sudden purpose dawned in his face. He said in a low tone at Lord Hertford's ear, "Answer me truly on thy faith and honor. Uttered I here a command the which none but a king might hold privilege and prerogative to utter? Would such commandment be obeyed, and none rise up to say me nay?" "None, my liege, in all these realms. In thy person bides the majesty of England. Thou art the king, thy word is law." Tom responded in a strong, earnest voice, and with great animation, "Then shall the king's law be law of mercy from this day, and never more be law of blood. Up from thy knees and away, to the Tower, and say the king decrees the Duke of Norfolk shall not die." Note 7. The Duke of Norfolk's narrow escape. Had Henry VIII survived a few hours longer, his order for the Duke's execution would have been carried into effect. But news being carried to the Tower that the king himself had expired that night, the lieutenant deferred obeying the warrant, and it was not thought advisable by the council to begin a new reign by the death of the greatest nobleman in the kingdom, who had been condemned by a sentence so unjust and tyrannical. Hume's England, Volume 3, page 307. The words were caught up and carried eagerly from lip to lip, far and wide over the hall, and as Hertford hurried from the presence, another prodigious shout burst forth, "The reign of blood is ended! Long live Edward, King of England!" Chapter 12. The Prince and His Deliverer. As soon as Miles Hendon and the little prince were clear of the mob, they struck down through back lanes and alleys toward the river. Their way was unobstructed until they approached London Bridge. Then they plowed into the multitude again, Hendon keeping a fast grip upon the prince's, the king's wrist. The tremendous news was already abroad, and the boy learned it from 1,000 voices at once. "The king is dead!" The tidings struck a chill to the heart of the poor little waif, and sent a shudder through his frame. He realized the greatness of his loss, and was filled with a bitter grief, for the grim tyrant who had been such a terror to others had always been gentle with him. The tears sprung to his eyes and blurred all objects, and for an instant he felt himself the most forlorn, outcast, and forsaken of God's creatures. Then another cry shook the night with its far-reaching thunder, "Long live King Edward VI!" And this made his eyes kindle and thrilled him with pride to his fingers' ends. "Ah," he thought, "how grand and strange it seems! I am king." Our friends threaded their ways slowly through the throngs upon the bridge. This structure, which had stood for 600 years and had been a noisy and populous thoroughfare all that time, was a curious affair, for a closely packed rank of stores and shops, with family quarters overhead, stretched along both sides of it from one bank of the river to the other. The bridge was a sort of town to itself. It had its inn, its beer houses, its bakeries, its haberdasheries, its food markets, its manufacturing industries, and even its church. It looked upon the two neighbors which it linked, London and Southwark, as being well enough as suburbs, but not otherwise particularly important. It was a close corporation, so to speak. It was a narrow town of a single street 1/5 of a mile long. Its population was but a village population, and everybody in it knew all his fellow townsmen intimately, and had known their fathers and mothers before them, and all their little family affairs into the bargain. It had its aristocracy, of course, its fine old families of butchers and bakers and what-not, who had occupied the same old premises for 500 or 600 years, and knew the great history of the bridge from beginning to end, and all its strange legends, and who always talked bridgy talk, and thought bridgy thoughts, and lied in a long, level, direct, substantial, bridgy way. It was just the sort of population to be narrow and ignorant and self-conceited. Children were born on the bridge, were reared there, grew to old age, and finally died without ever having set foot upon any part of the world but London Bridge alone. Such people would naturally imagine that the mighty and interminable procession which moved through its street, night and day, with its confused roar of shouts and cries, its neighings and bellowings and bleatings, and its muffled thunder tramp, was the one great thing in the world, and they themselves somehow the proprietors of it. And so they were, in effect. At least they could exhibit it from their windows, and did, for a consideration, whenever a returning king or hero gave it a fleeting splendor, for there was no place like it for affording a long, straight, uninterrupted view of marching columns. Men born and reared upon the bridge found life unendurably dull and inane elsewhere. History tells of one of these who left the bridge at the age of 71 and retired to the country. But he could only fret and toss in his bed. He could not go to sleep. The deep stillness was so painful, so awful, so oppressive. When he was worn out with it at last, he fled back to his old home, a lean and haggard spectre, and fell peacefully to rest and pleasant dreams under the lulling music of the lashing waters and the boom and crash and thunder of London Bridge. In the times of which we are writing, the bridge furnished object lessons in English history for its children, namely, the livid and decaying heads of renowned men impaled upon iron spikes atop of its gateways. But we digress. Hendon's lodgings were in the little inn on the bridge. As he neared the door with his small friend, a rough voice said, "So thou'rt come at last. Thou'lt not escape again, I warrant thee, and if pounding thy bones to a pudding can teach thee somewhat, thou'lt not put us waiting another time, mayhap." And John Canty put out his hand to seize the boy. Miles Hendon stepped in the way and said, "Not too fast, friend. Thou art needlessly rough, methinks. What is the lad to thee?" "If it be any business of thine to make and meddle in others' affairs, he is my son." "'Tis a lie," cried the little king hotly. "Boldly said, and I believe thee, whether thy small headpiece be sound or cracked, my boy. But whether this scurvy ruffian be thy father or no, 'tis all one. He shall not have thee to beat thee and abuse according to his threat. So thou prefer to bide with me?" I do. I know him not, I loathe him, and will die before I will go with him." "Then 'tis settled, and there is naught more to say." "We will see as to that," exclaimed John Canty, striding past Hendon to get at the boy. "By force shall he—" "If thou do but touch him, thou animated offal, I will spit thee like a goose," said Hendon, barring the way and laying his hand upon his sword hilt. Canty drew back. "Now mark ye," continued Hendon. I took this lad under my protection when a mob of such as thou would have mishandled him, mayhap killed him. Dost thou imagine I will desert him now to a worser fate? For whether thou art his father or no, and sooth to say I think it is a lie, a decent swift death were better for such a lad than life in such brute hands as thine. So go thy ways, and set quick about it, for I like not much bandying of words, being not over-patient in my nature." John Canty moved off, muttering threats and curses, and was swallowed from sight in the crowd. Hendon ascended 3 flights of stairs to his room with his charge, after ordering a meal to be sent thither. It was a poor apartment, with a shabby bed and some odds and ends of old furniture in it, and was vaguely lighted by a couple of sickly candles. The little king dragged himself to the bed and lay down upon it, almost exhausted with hunger and fatigue. He had been on his feet a good part of a day and a night, for it was now 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and had eaten nothing meantime. He murmured drowsily, "Prithee call me when the table is spread," and sunk into a deep sleep immediately. A smile twinkled into Hendon's eye, and he said to himself, "By the mass, the little beggar takes to one's quarters and usurps one's bed with as natural and easy a grace as if he owned them, with never a by your leave, or so please it you, or anything of the sort. In his diseased ravings he called himself the Prince of Wales, and bravely doth he keep up the character. Poor little friendless rat! Doubtless his mind has been disordered with ill usage. Well, I will be his friend. I have saved him, and it draweth me strongly to him. Already I love the bold-tongued little rascal. How soldier-like he faced the smutty rabble and flung back his high defiance. And what a comely, sweet, and gentle face he hath, now that sleep hath conjured away its troubles and its griefs. I will teach him, I will cure his malady. Yea, I will be his elder brother, and care for him, and watch over him. And whoso would shame him or do him hurt may order his shroud. For though I be burnt for it, he shall need it." He bent over the boy and contemplated him with kind and pitying interest, tapping the young cheek tenderly and smoothing back the tangled curls with his great brown hand. A slight shiver passed over the boy's form. Hendon muttered, "See now how like a man it was to let him lie here uncovered and fill his body with deadly rheums. Now what shall I do? 'Twill wake him to take him up and put him within the bed, and he sorely needeth sleep." He looked about for extra covering, but finding none, doffed his doublet and wrapped the lad in it, saying, "I am used to nipping air and scant apparel. 'Tis little I shall mind the cold," then walked up and down the room to keep his blood in motion, soliloquizing as before. His injured mind persuades him he is Prince of Wales. 'Twill be odd to have a Prince of Wales still with us, now that he that was the prince is prince no more, but king. For this poor mind is set upon the one fantasy, and will not reason out that now it should cast by the prince, and call itself the king. If my father liveth still, after these 7 years that I have heard naught from home, in my foreign dungeon, he will welcome the poor lad, and give him generous shelter for my sake. So will my good elder brother, Arthur. My other brother, Hugh. But I will crack his crown, and he interfere, the fox-hearted, ill-conditioned animal. Yes, thither will we fare, and straightway, too." A servant entered with a smoking meal, disposed it upon a small deal table, placed the chairs, and took his departure, leaving such cheap lodgers as these to wait upon themselves. The door slammed after him, and the noise woke the boy, who sprung to a sitting posture, and shot a glad glance about him. Then a grieved look came into his face, and he murmured to himself with a deep sigh, "Alack, it was but a dream. Woe is me." Next he noticed Miles Hendon's doublet, glanced from that to Hendon, comprehended the sacrifice that had been made for him, and said gently, "Thou art good to me. Yes, thou art very good to me. Take it and put it on. I shall not need it more." Then he got up and walked to the washstand in the corner and stood there waiting. Hendon said in a cheery voice, "We'll have a right hearty sup and bite now, for everything is savory and smoking hot. And that and thy nap together will make thee a little man again, never fear." The boy made no answer, but bent a steady look that was filled with grave surprise, and somewhat touched with impatience upon the tall knight of the sword. Hendon was puzzled, and said, "What's amiss?" "Good sir, I would wash me." "Oh, is that all? Ask no permission of Miles Hendon for aught thou cravest. Make thyself perfectly free here, and welcome with all that are his belongings." Still the boy stood, and moved not. He tapped the floor once or twice with his small, impatient foot. Hendon was wholly perplexed. Said he, "Bless us, what is it?" "Prithee, pour the water, and make not so many words." Hendon, suppressing a horse laugh, and saying to himself, "By the saints, but this is admirable," stepped briskly forward and did the small insolent's bidding. Then stood by in a sort of stupefaction until the command, "Come, the towel," woke him sharply up. He took up a towel from under the boy's nose and handed it to him without comment. He now proceeded to comfort his own face with a wash, and while he was at it, his adopted child seated himself at the table and prepared to fall to. Hendon dispatched his ablutions with alacrity, then drew back the other chair, and was about to place himself at table, when the boy said indignantly, "Forbear! Wouldst sit in the presence of the king?" This blow staggered Hendon to his foundations. He muttered to himself, "Lo, the poor thing's madness is up with the time. It hath changed with the great change that is come to the realm, and now, in fancy, is he king. Good lack, I must humour the conceit, too. There is no other way. Faith, he would order me to the Tower, else." And, pleased with this jest, he removed the chair from the table, took his stand behind the king, and proceeded to wait upon him in the courtliest way he was capable of. While the king ate, the rigor of his royal dignity relaxed a little, and with his growing contentment came a desire to talk. He said, "I think thou call'st thyself Miles Hendon, if I heard thee aright?" "Yes, sire," Miles replied, then observed to himself, "If I must humour the poor lad's madness, I must sire him, I must majesty him, I must not go by halves. I must stick at nothing that belongeth to the part I play, else shall I play it ill, and work evil to this charitable and kindly cause." The king warmed his heart with a second glass of wine, and said, "I would know thee. Tell me thy story. Thou hast a gallant way with thee, and a noble. Art nobly born?" "We are of the tail of the nobility, good your majesty. My father is a baronet, one of the smaller lords, my knight's service, Sir Richard Hendon of Hendon Hall, by Monk's Holm in Kent." He refers to the order of baronets or baronets, the barones minores, as distinct from the parliamentary barons, not, it need hardly be said, the baronets of later creation. "The name has escaped my memory. Go on, tell me thy story." "'Tis not much, your majesty, yet perchance it may beguile a short half-hour for want of a better." My father, Sir Richard, is very rich and of a most generous nature. My mother died whilst I was yet a boy. I have two brothers, Arthur, my elder, with a soul like to his father's, and Hugh, younger than I, a mean spirit, covetous, treacherous, vicious, underhanded, a reptile. Such was he from the cradle, such was he 10 years past, when I last saw him, a ripe rascal at 19, I being 20 then, and Arthur 22. There is none other of us but the Lady Edith, my cousin. She was 16 then, beautiful, gentle, good, the daughter of an earl, the last of her race, heiress of a great fortune and a lapsed title. My father was her guardian. I loved her, and she loved me, but she was betrothed to Arthur from the cradle, and Sir Richard would not suffer the contract to be broken. Arthur loved another maid, and bade us be of good cheer, and hold fast to the hope that delay and luck together would some day give success to our several causes. Hugh loved the Lady Edith's fortune, though in truth he said it was herself he loved. But then 'twas his way, alway, to say the one thing and mean the other. But he lost his arts upon the girl. He could deceive my father, but none else. My father loved him best of us all, and trusted and believed him, for he was the youngest child, and others hated him. These qualities being in all ages sufficient to win a parent's dearest love, and he had a smooth, persuasive tongue, with an admirable gift of lying, and these be qualities which do mightily assist a blind affection to cozen itself. I was wild. In troth I might go yet farther, and say very wild, though 'twas a wildness of an innocent sort, since it hurt none but me, brought shame to none, nor loss, nor had in it any taint of crime or baseness, or what might not beseem mine honourable degree. Yet did my brother Hugh turn these faults to good account. He, seeing that our brother Arthur's health was but indifferent, and hoping the worst might work him profit were I swept out of the path. But 'twere a long tale, good my liege, and little worth the telling. Briefly, then, this brother did deftly magnify my faults and make them crimes, ending his base work with finding a silken ladder in my apartments, conveyed thither by his own means, and did convince my father by this and suborned evidence of servants and other lying knaves that I was minded to carry off my Edith and marry her in rank defiance of his will. 3 years of banishment from home and England might make a soldier and a man of me, my father said, and teach me some degree of wisdom.